Between the years 1500 and 1880, the world experienced a movement of people so vast, so dramatic, that it forever changed the course of history. It is often called one of the greatest forced migrations in human history. Over those centuries, between 10 and 12 million Africans were taken across the Atlantic Ocean. They came from different regions, spoke many languages, and belonged to countless traditions and communities. Yet their fates were bound together on ships that crossed the ocean toward the Americas. What makes this story so powerful is not only the staggering number of lives involved, but also the human cost of the journey itself. The trip across the Atlantic became known as the Middle Passage. For those placed on board, it was a passage filled with hardship, uncertainty, and loss. Historical accounts tell us that between 15 and 25% of the people who began this voyage did not make it to the other side. To put it another way, for every 4 people who left the African coast, at least one never saw land again. But behind these statistics are human stories. Each number represents a person, a son, a daughter, a parent, a neighbor, someone with a name, a past, and a future that was cut short or altered forever. Before this chapter of history, these men and women were farmers, musicians, traders, and leaders. They lived in thriving societies rich with culture and tradition. Yet the world they knew was transformed in ways they could never have imagined. The impact was not limited to the people themselves. Families were broken apart. Villages lost generations of young men and women. Entire regions of Africa felt the loss for centuries. On the other side of the ocean, new communities were created under difficult circumstances, and those communities carried with them pieces of Africa, songs, languages, beliefs, and strength. Out of this pain came resilience, and out of displacement came cultural rebirths that shaped music, food, and identity across the world. This story is not just about the past. It is about how our world today was shaped by these events. The movement of millions of people influenced economies, politics, and cultures on 3 continents. It left behind legacies we still feel in our societies, in our identities, and in the questions of justice and equality that continue to challenge us. As we explore this history together, we will look beyond the numbers and try to see the people. We will listen for the voices that history books too often overlook. We will discover not only what was taken, but also what endured, the resilience, the creativity, and the unbreakable human spirit. If you believe stories like this should continue to be told, if you want to help bring history out of the shadows and into the light, I invite you to support this journey. Please give this video a like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. With your support, we can keep uncovering the hidden stories of our shared past and share them with the world. Together, we can learn, reflect, and create a better future by understanding the truths of yesterday. Along the vast coastline of West and Central Africa, there once stood thriving societies filled with life, trade, music, and tradition. From the Senegambia region in the northwest to the deep forests of West Central Africa, these lands were home to countless communities, each with its own culture, language, and heritage. It was from these very places that millions of Africans were taken, carried across the Atlantic Ocean into a new and unfamiliar world. When we speak of Senegambia, we are talking about the lands around the Senegal and Gambia rivers. This region was once a crossroads of cultures. It had strong kingdoms, bustling trade networks, and communities tied to the rhythms of the river. Here, people grew crops, raised livestock, and crafted goods that traveled far and wide. But as the Atlantic trade expanded, this region became one of the earliest and most heavily targeted areas. Villages that had existed for centuries suddenly found themselves vulnerable to raids and conflict, their people swept away from familiar lands. Further down the coast, Sierra Leone tells another chapter of this history. Known for its lush forests and rich resources, it was also known for its diversity of peoples. Dozens of ethnic groups lived there, each with unique traditions. The rivers and coastline made Sierra Leone a strategic location for European traders who arrived with goods to exchange. Over time, it became one of the major departure points where countless Africans were placed onto ships. The memories of these departures still linger in local stories, passed down through generations. The Gold Coast, today known as Ghana, was another critical region. For centuries before the Atlantic trade, it was famous for its gold, drawing merchants from across Africa and beyond. Strong kingdoms like the Ashanti rose here, powerful in both culture and military strength. But as demand for labor in the Americas grew, this region too became deeply entangled in the trade. Forts and castles were built along the shoreline, massive stone structures that still stand today. These fortresses served as holding points where men, women, and children were kept before their departure. The walls of these buildings hold stories of sorrow and survival that echo across centuries. Moving eastward, the Bight of Benin and the Bight of Biafra became central hubs of this history. The Bight of Benin, stretching along what is now Nigeria, Togo, and Benin, was home to powerful kingdoms like Dahomey and Oyo. These states were deeply involved in regional politics, trade, and warfare, and their interactions with European traders left a lasting impact on the area. The Bight of Biafra, further east, included the Niger Delta and lands around it. Known for its maze of rivers and dense mangroves, it was home to the Igbo and many other peoples. This region provided a large share of the Africans taken across the Atlantic. The stories of displacement from here are especially powerful, as communities were torn apart, and families separated for generations. Finally, there is West Central Africa, the single largest source of people taken during this time. Covering modern-day Angola, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and surrounding areas, this region contributed millions to the Atlantic trade. It was here that the Kingdom of Congo once thrived, a kingdom that had centuries of history and complex systems of governance and culture. When European ships arrived, they created new pressures, fueling wars and conflicts that led to massive displacements. The impact on this region was devastating, and its effects can still be felt today in the cultural memory of its people. What connects all these places, Senegambia, Sierra Leone, the Gold Coast, the Bight of Benin, the Bight of Biafra, and West Central Africa, is that they were once vibrant centers of African civilization. They had strong leaders, advanced societies, and cultural traditions that stretched back countless generations. They were not empty lands waiting to be changed, they were full of life, knowledge, and heritage. Yet the demand for labor across the Atlantic meant that these regions became the focus of one of the most significant movements of people in history. When we think about this, it is important not to reduce the story to numbers alone. Each of these regions lost not just people but also pieces of their future. Skilled farmers, artisans, soldiers, musicians, and storytellers were taken away. Entire families were broken apart, communities disrupted, and generations left with deep scars. And yet, the memory of these regions traveled with those who crossed the ocean. In the Americas, they carried their traditions, their songs, and their strength. They built new communities, preserved their heritage in hidden ways, and influenced cultures far beyond their original homelands. Today, when we look at the music, food, and traditions of the African diaspora, we can still trace the roots back to these very regions. The rhythms of West African drums can be heard in jazz, blues, and samba. The foods of Africa inspired dishes across the Caribbean and the Americas. Even the stories and proverbs of African societies found new life on distant shores. The resilience of these people ensured that, even in the face of unimaginable hardship, their heritage would not disappear. The story of these regions is therefore not only one of loss but also one of survival. The people of Senegambia, Sierra Leone, the Gold Coast, the Bights of Benin and Biafra, and West Central Africa carried with them an unbreakable spirit. They became the foundation of new cultures in the Americas, blending African roots with influences from Europe and the indigenous peoples of the New World. Out of pain came resilience, and out of displacement came creativity. As we reflect on this history, it reminds us of the importance of memory. These regions were not simply points on a map where people were taken, they were homelands, places of belonging, and sources of identity. Their stories continue to shape the world today, teaching us lessons about endurance, culture, and the shared humanity that binds us all. By remembering these places and the people who came from them, we honor their stories. We recognize that history is not just about events but about individuals and communities whose voices still matter. And by learning from the past, we create a future where such stories are never forgotten again. The journey across the Atlantic, remembered as the Middle Passage, stands as one of the most difficult chapters in human history. For those taken from their homelands, this voyage was not only long but also filled with unimaginable challenges. The conditions on the ships that carried them were harsh and unforgiving. Overcrowding, lack of food, spreading illnesses, mistreatment, and the constant fear of death made the passage a trial that tested every ounce of human endurance. Imagine a ship built to carry goods now crammed with people. Every corner of space was used. Men, women, and children were confined in small areas with barely enough room to move. The air was thick and stifling, and with so many bodies pressed together, it became almost impossible to breathe. For weeks, sometimes months, people remained in these confined spaces, hearing only the creaks of the ship and the cries of others around them. Food and water, the most basic needs of survival, were scarce. Rations were given in small amounts, often not enough to satisfy hunger or quench thirst. For many, this meant enduring the slow, painful weakness of starvation. Dehydration only made matters worse. The ocean stretched endlessly outside, yet the people inside the ship could not touch a single drop of its water. The lack of nourishment left them vulnerable, their bodies weakening with each passing day. In such an environment, illness spread quickly. With so many confined together, any sickness could move from person to person in a matter of days. Fevers, coughs, and infections became common. Without proper medicine or care, even small ailments could become deadly. The dampness of the ship, combined with poor sanitation, created the perfect setting for disease to thrive. For many, illness was inescapable, and countless lives were lost before the journey even reached its halfway point. But beyond physical suffering, there was also the weight of emotional pain. To be taken from one's home, separated from family, and placed in such conditions brought despair. People who once lived free lives now found themselves trapped in an uncertain fate. Some tried to hold on to hope, whispering prayers, singing quiet songs, or speaking words of encouragement to one another. These small acts of resistance gave strength, even in the darkest hours. Yet for others, the hopelessness was overwhelming. The ocean itself became a symbol of both captivity and loss. Those in charge of the ships often treated the captives with cruelty. Discipline was harsh, and any attempt to resist or disobey could be met with severe consequences. The human dignity of those on board was stripped away, replaced with control and fear. And yet, even under such conditions, the human spirit was not completely broken. There are stories of people who fought back, of groups who resisted even when the odds were against them. Their courage remains part of the history of the Middle Passage, a reminder that even in the face of suffering, strength endured. Mortality rates on these voyages were high. Historians estimate that between 15 and 25% of those taken aboard never survived the crossing. This means that out of every 100 people who entered a ship, at least 15 never reached the shore on the other side. Their stories ended in the vast expanse of the ocean, lives cut short far from the land of their birth. For those who did survive, the memory of what they endured stayed with them forever. The Middle Passage was more than just a physical journey, it was a transformation that reshaped entire worlds. For the captives, survival meant arriving in a place entirely unknown, where new challenges awaited. For the societies left behind in Africa, it meant the loss of countless sons, daughters, and leaders. And for the world as a whole, it was the beginning of cultural blending and the creation of new identities, forged out of both pain and resilience. When we think about the conditions on these ships, it is easy to focus only on the suffering. Yet within that suffering, there was also resilience. People survived against the odds. They carried with them their languages, their songs, their beliefs, and their strength. Even when the ships tried to confine them, their spirits traveled across the ocean. These traditions took root in new lands, shaping music, religion, and culture for centuries to come. Today, When we remember the Middle Passage, we must acknowledge both sides of the story, the suffering that should never be forgotten and the resilience that should always be honored. The overcrowded holds, the hunger, the sickness, the mistreatment, and the lives lost all form part of this history. But so too does the endurance of the human spirit, which carried memories of Africa across the ocean and planted them in new soil. The conditions of the ships serve as a stark reminder of what happens when humanity is denied. They teach us about the consequences of greed, exploitation, and indifference. At the same time, the survival of so many through such hardship shows us the strength of hope, faith, and community. Together, these lessons form the heart of the Middle Passage's legacy. By telling these stories, we ensure that the voices of those who endured are not lost. Their journey was one of pain, but also of perseverance. Their memory lives on not only in history books but in the cultures, music, and traditions that still echo their presence today. The story of the Middle Passage belongs to all of us, a reminder of humanity's darkest moments and humanity's greatest strength, the ability to endure, to adapt, and to create new life out of loss. In the early modern world, the oceans became highways of exchange. Across these waters, ships carried not just people, but goods, ideas, and fortunes. One of the most significant systems of trade that shaped centuries of history was the triangular exchange linking Europe, Africa, and the Americas. This system was not a simple exchange of products, it was a cycle that reshaped continents, altered societies, and left a lasting impact on the world we know today. The triangle began in Europe. From ports like Liverpool, Bristol, Lisbon, and Nantes, ships set sail loaded with goods. These were not random items, but carefully chosen products designed for exchange. Guns, textiles, metal tools, alcohol, beads, and other manufactured goods filled the cargo holds. To European merchants, these items represented wealth and bargaining power. To communities along the African coast, they became part of a growing economy of trade, sometimes tied to local rivalries and conflicts. When the ships reached Africa, they anchored along the vast coastline from Senegambia to Angola. Here, the goods from Europe were exchanged for human lives. Leaders of local states and traders, sometimes under pressure from warfare or economic need, supplied captives in return for the European items. This exchange was devastating. Communities across Africa saw their populations diminished, families broken, and traditional systems of life disrupted. Yet for European traders, this step of the cycle was highly profitable. The captives they obtained would form the foundation of the next leg of the triangular journey. The second leg, known as the Middle Passage, was the most brutal. Captives were transported across the Atlantic to the Americas. The journey was long, sometimes stretching over months, and the conditions were harsh beyond measure. For those who survived, a new life awaited on distant shores, far removed from their homelands. They were forced to work on plantations in the Caribbean, Brazil, and North America, producing crops that would soon flow back into global trade networks. It was in the Americas that the triangle revealed its full economic purpose. Plantations produced massive amounts of sugar, tobacco, cotton, and coffee. These raw products, harvested by enslaved labor, became the backbone of European wealth. Sugar sweetened the tea and coffee that had become popular in European households. Tobacco became a widespread luxury. Cotton fed the looms of the growing textile industry, powering the Industrial Revolution. Each crop was tied to the labor of millions of Africans who had been taken across the ocean. The third leg of the triangle brought these plantation goods back to Europe. Ships heavy with sugar, tobacco, cotton, and coffee arrived in ports where merchants grew rich and economies expanded. European cities thrived, banks and insurance companies rose to power, and industries grew. The profits from these goods did not stop at trade, they funded exploration, war, and the very foundations of modern economies. This cycle of exchange created immense wealth for some, while leaving others in chains. The triangular trade was not only economic, it was cultural as well. Each leg of the journey carried pieces of one continent to another. European manufactured goods flowed into African societies, altering local economies and political systems. African people, forcibly displaced, carried their traditions, music, and spirituality into the Americas, blending with indigenous and European cultures to create entirely new cultural expressions. The plantation products returned to Europe reshaped daily life, changing diets, habits, and even social customs. To understand the scale of this system, one must imagine the constant motion of ships across the oceans. At any given time, vessels were leaving Europe, anchoring along the African coast, braving the Atlantic, unloading in the Americas, and returning once more to Europe. It was a continuous cycle that never rested, driven by profit and demand. The triangle was not just a trade route, it was a machine that kept economies moving, even as it consumed human lives. For Europe, the triangular system built empires. The wealth generated supported palaces, funded armies, and expanded colonies. For Africa, it was a time of immense loss, as communities were torn apart and populations depleted. For the Americas, it created societies that were forever shaped by the presence of African labor and culture. Each continent carried the weight of the triangle, but in vastly different ways. Even today, the legacies of this triangular system can be felt. The African diaspora, spread across the Americas, still maintains connections to ancestral traditions. The wealth that fueled Europe's rise continues to echo in its institutions and cities. And the cultural blending in the Americas has created some of the world's most vibrant and influential traditions in music, food, and art. The story of the triangular trade is not just about economics, it is about people. Behind every shipment of sugar or bale of cotton were hands that harvested it under conditions of suffering. Behind every ship leaving Europe were merchants calculating profit and risk. Behind every exchange on the African coast were communities making impossible choices under pressure of conflict and survival. This triangular system demonstrates how interconnected the world became in the early modern period. It was not a system of equals, but one that depended on exploitation and imbalance. Yet from this painful history came resilience. The people who were carried across oceans did not lose everything. They rebuilt, preserved, and transformed their cultures in new lands. Their descendants today continue to shape the world in countless ways. The triangle of Europe, Africa, and the Americas was more than a trade route, it was a cycle of history that changed the course of the modern world. It brought wealth to some, loss to others, and cultural transformations that remain with us today. By remembering this story, we acknowledge not just the goods that moved across the seas, but the people who endured, survived, and left behind a legacy that still speaks across time. When Europeans first arrived in the Americas, they encountered vast lands rich with resources and peoples who had lived there for countless generations. The newcomers, eager to build settlements and extract wealth, looked to the indigenous populations as a source of labor. At first, many colonizers forced local people into servitude, demanding work on plantations, in mines, and in fields. But this arrangement did not last as they had imagined. The indigenous peoples of the Americas faced a sudden and devastating collapse. Diseases brought by Europeans, illnesses that had never existed in the Americas before, swept through villages and towns. Smallpox, measles, and influenza spread rapidly, striking down entire communities in waves. Populations that had been strong and thriving were suddenly reduced to fractions of their former numbers. Families were torn apart, leaders lost, and cultural traditions disrupted. The effects were catastrophic. For the colonizers, the decline of indigenous populations created a crisis of labor. Plantations demanded constant work, especially as crops like sugar, tobacco, and later cotton became essential to the economies of the colonies. Mines in regions like South America required an endless supply of workers to extract silver and gold. With fewer indigenous people available, European settlers sought alternatives to sustain their growing enterprises. It was in this moment of desperation and ambition that their focus turned across the Atlantic. Africa became the primary source of labor for the colonies. The decision was not sudden but gradual, built on networks of trade that had already begun to connect Europe and Africa. European traders realized that African captives, once transported across the ocean, could provide the large, enduring labor force they sought. Why Africa? Part of the reason lay in geography and existing systems of trade. European merchants were already sailing to African coasts, exchanging goods for people through arrangements with local rulers and traders. These exchanges grew as demand in the Americas increased. Another reason was the devastating impact of disease on indigenous Americans. Unlike the indigenous peoples who had no immunity to European illnesses, many Africans shared exposure to similar diseases due to centuries of contact with Eurasia. This tragic biological reality made them less vulnerable to certain outbreaks in the colonies. Colonizers, always seeking efficiency and profit, saw this as an advantage. The shift also reflected the colonizers' view of labor as something to be controlled, measured, and expanded. Indigenous peoples, rooted in their own homelands and resistant to being uprooted, often resisted forced servitude or fled into familiar lands where they could escape. Africans, taken far from their homes, had fewer immediate options for escape in the strange new world of the Americas. This cruel calculus made them targets for the growing system of transatlantic labor. As the numbers of Africans arriving in the Americas grew, the economic foundation of the colonies began to change. Plantations flourished with the new influx of workers. Sugar fields in the Caribbean, tobacco farms in Virginia, and coffee plantations in Brazil all expanded rapidly. The wealth produced from these crops flowed back to Europe, fueling empires and funding industries. The reliance on African labor became so deeply entrenched that it shaped laws, social systems, and entire cultures across the Americas. Yet within this shift, there were countless stories of resilience and humanity. The people who were transported carried with them not just their labor but their languages, beliefs, and traditions. They sang songs that reminded them of home, told stories that kept their heritage alive, and created new communities in foreign lands. Though they endured hardship, they also built bonds of solidarity that would sustain generations. The decision by early colonizers to replace indigenous labor with Africans was not just a practical choice, it was one that reshaped the world. Africa lost millions of people to the Atlantic system. The Americas saw the rise of societies built on a foundation of forced labor. Europe gained unprecedented wealth, becoming the center of global power for centuries. Each continent bore the marks of this decision, though not equally. For indigenous peoples, the population collapse was a tragedy that still echoes in memory today. Entire nations were diminished, their histories altered forever. For Africans, the transatlantic journey was a rupture that separated them from their homelands yet forged a vast diaspora whose cultural influence remains powerful. For Europeans, the wealth generated by this shift became the cornerstone of modern empires, economies, and industries. Looking back, the story of this transition reminds us how decisions made in pursuit of profit and power can alter the course of human history. Colonizers sought a solution to their labor crisis, and in doing so they created one of the largest forced migrations the world has ever seen. The consequences cannot be measured in numbers alone, but in the enduring legacies of pain, resilience, and cultural transformation that followed. The early reliance on indigenous peoples, and the later shift to Africans, shows how the Americas were shaped not just by the land itself but by the struggles over who would work it, who would profit, and who would endure. It is a reminder that behind every crop harvested, every mine excavated, and every city built during this era were the lives of people who bore the weight of those ambitions. This chapter of history, though filled with hardship, also demonstrates the enduring strength of human beings. Both indigenous and African peoples faced immense challenges, yet both carried their traditions forward, adapting and reshaping them in new worlds. Their survival ensured that their voices, though silenced by many at the time, still resonate today. The collapse of indigenous populations and the subsequent importation of Africans were not simply events of the past, they were turning points that set the stage for the modern world. They reshaped demographics, economies, and cultures on a global scale. And in remembering this shift, we honor those whose lives were forever changed by it, ensuring that their stories are not lost to the tides of history. When Spain first established its presence in the Americas, the question of labor became a pressing issue. Vast new lands stretched before the colonizers, filled with resources waiting to be extracted, yet cultivating these lands required immense human effort. At first, Spain hesitated to rely on Africans as a source of labor. The early Spanish crown sought to regulate the growing system of servitude in the colonies with laws that, on paper, aimed to protect indigenous peoples from the worst abuses. There was also a deep religious dimension to these choices. The Spanish monarchy, closely tied to the Catholic Church, viewed the forced conversion of non-Christian peoples as both a duty and a justification for colonization. In the earliest years, Spain attempted to use indigenous labor through systems such as the encomienda. Colonists were granted the right to demand work and tribute from local populations in exchange for promises of protection and instruction in Christianity. But this system soon revealed its flaws. Disease, overwork, and harsh conditions led to the rapid decline of indigenous communities. Missionaries, particularly figures like Bartolomé de las Casas, spoke out against the mistreatment of indigenous peoples, urging the crown to rethink its policies. Their arguments, grounded in morality and religion, reached the ears of kings and queens who wished to present themselves as defenders of the faith. It was in this climate of moral debate and practical need that the question of African labor arose. At first, Spanish authorities resisted. The introduction of Africans into the colonies as a large-scale workforce was not immediately embraced. Concerns ranged from religious justifications to logistical challenges. But as the indigenous populations continued to collapse and the demand for labor grew, hesitation gave way to pragmatism. Spanish colonizers began to argue that Africans, once converted to Christianity, could serve as legitimate laborers in the empire. This shift marked a turning point. The crown eventually legalized the practice under a condition that reveals the fusion of faith and economics in Spain's empire. Africans brought to the Americas were to be baptized and taught the ways of Christianity. In theory, this condition was meant to align labor with religious duty. In practice, it became a formal mechanism through which the Spanish monarchy accelerated the trade. Conversion became not a shield against exploitation, but a requirement that justified it. As a result, Spain's colonies began to transform. In the Caribbean, plantations grew rapidly, producing sugar, tobacco, and other crops that required vast amounts of labor. The mines of Mexico and Peru demanded thousands of workers to extract silver and gold. With legal sanction, merchants and traders expanded their networks, transporting ever larger numbers of Africans across the Atlantic. The Spanish crown, for its part, profited not only from the wealth generated in the colonies but also from the licensing system that regulated the flow of people into the New World. This legalization under the banner of conversion was not merely an economic decision, it was a cultural one as well. The presence of Africans in Spain's American colonies reshaped society in profound ways. Alongside indigenous peoples and Europeans, Africans contributed to the formation of new cultural identities. Music, food, language, and spiritual traditions blended into rich, hybrid cultures that are still visible today across Latin America and the Caribbean. Yet behind these cultural contributions lay a history of struggle. The justification of conversion often masked the harsh realities of forced labor. Baptism might have been performed, prayers might have been spoken, but the daily lives of those brought across the ocean were filled with backbreaking work and limited freedoms. The condition of conversion, intended by some as a form of spiritual inclusion, in reality provided Spain with a moral argument to expand one of the most exploitative systems in history. As the decades passed, Spain's initial reluctance seemed like a distant memory. By the 16th and 17th centuries, the empire had become deeply invested in the system of African labor. Other European powers soon followed, creating competition and fueling the wider transatlantic trade. What had begun with hesitation became one of the engines of Spain's global empire. The silver flowing from Potosi, the sugar harvested in the Caribbean, and the tobacco cultivated in Cuba all depended on the work of Africans who had been brought under the Crown's laws of forced conversion. At the same time, African communities in the Americas grew. Despite the circumstances, these communities preserved fragments of their traditions while adapting to their new environment. Christianity itself took on new forms, as African spiritual practices merged with Catholic rituals, creating unique expressions of faith. This cultural blending was one of the unintended consequences of Spain's policy, revealing how people, even under the harshest conditions, reshaped the world around them. Looking back, Spain's decision to legalize African labor under the banner of conversion reveals the complex interplay of morality, faith, and power in the colonial era. The crown sought to balance the image of a Christian empire with the practical demands of economic expansion. Missionaries like Las Casas may have won some victories in protecting indigenous peoples, but those same victories opened the door to a massive reliance on African labor. It was a trade-off that forever altered the demographic and cultural landscapes of the Americas. The legacy of this decision is still felt today. Across Latin America and the Caribbean, the descendants of Africans brought under Spain's laws continue to shape societies with their traditions, languages, and resilience. The blending of cultures, born from painful beginnings, produced music, cuisine, and art that are celebrated worldwide. At the same time, the inequalities created during this period continue to echo across centuries. Spain's initial resistance reminds us that history is never a straight line. Choices made in hesitation can turn into policies that transform the world. The requirement of Christian conversion, meant to give moral cover, became a stepping stone to one of the largest forced migrations in human history. It is a story of faith intertwined with empire, of profit hidden behind prayers, and of people who endured and transformed despite the weight of colonization. By understanding how Spain's early choices evolved, we gain a clearer picture of how the transatlantic system grew. It was not inevitable, but shaped by debates, laws, and shifting needs. And within that story, the voices of those who lived through it, indigenous, African, and European alike, remind us that history is always more than dates and decrees. It is the lived experience of millions, carried forward in memory and culture. Along the vast coasts and deep interior of Africa, societies in the 15th and 16th centuries thrived in many different forms. There were kingdoms ruled by powerful monarchs, smaller communities led by councils of elders, and warrior groups whose strength rested in their ability to defend their people. Trade had always been part of life. Gold, ivory, and salt moved across deserts and along rivers, connecting Africa with the wider world. But with the arrival of Europeans along the Atlantic shores, new opportunities and dangers emerged. At first, the Europeans who sailed to Africa were outsiders, unfamiliar with the land and its politics. They could not simply walk inland and take what they wanted, they needed allies. African rulers and local leaders understood this and engaged with them as partners in trade. Goods like textiles, firearms, metal tools, and beads became part of exchanges. Over time, however, the demands of Europeans shifted. What they valued most was not only gold or spices but people, captives who could be taken across the ocean to labor in the growing colonies of the Americas. This demand created complicated choices for African societies. Some leaders resisted, refusing to participate or seeking to protect their people. Others, facing internal rivalries or the constant pressure of warfare, saw an opportunity. Capturing enemies in battle was not a new practice. In many African traditions, captives might be integrated into local societies, put to work, or held in servitude. What changed was the scale and destination of this practice. With Europeans offering goods in exchange for captives, the incentive to capture rivals grew stronger. In certain regions, rulers used the trade to strengthen their power. By providing captives to European traders, they gained access to firearms and other resources, which in turn gave them military advantages over neighboring states. Wars that might once have ended with peace treaties or the absorption of a few captives now escalated, driven by the rewards of trade. Leaders sometimes turned against their rivals with renewed ferocity, knowing that every person captured could be exchanged for goods that expanded their influence. Not all participants were kings or chiefs. Local groups, including war bands and traders, also became involved. Some saw the trade as a means to settle old disputes, using alliances with Europeans to weaken their enemies. Others treated it as a way to rid their communities of those considered criminals or outsiders. What might once have been a punishment that ended with exile now ended with a march to the coast, where European ships waited. The alliances that formed between African leaders and European traders were complex. Negotiations often took place on equal terms, with African rulers dictating the conditions under which Europeans could build forts or conduct business. In many cases, Europeans had little choice but to accept these terms, as they depended on African cooperation for access to the interior. This was not a story of one-sided domination at first, but of shifting power balances where both sides sought to gain. Still, the consequences of these choices rippled outward. Communities that engaged heavily in the trade sometimes grew wealthy and powerful, but they also grew dependent on it. The constant demand for captives meant that conflict became a permanent feature of life in some regions. Villages feared raids from neighbors, and rivalries deepened into cycles of violence. The social fabric of many societies began to fray under the weight of these pressures. For the individuals captured, the story was even more tragic. Many were taken during wars or raids, torn from their families and marched long distances to coastal ports. They were strangers in the places where they were held, surrounded by foreign languages and faces. For those sold to European traders, the coast marked the end of one life and the beginning of another across the sea. It is important to remember that not all African leaders supported or participated in the trade. Some resisted fiercely, protecting their people and rejecting European offers. Others sought to negotiate terms that limited the scale of involvement. But the growing demand from across the Atlantic, combined with the internal rivalries and political struggles within Africa, ensured that the trade expanded year after year. Over time, these alliances with Europeans transformed African politics. States that aligned themselves with traders often grew more powerful in the short term, while those that resisted sometimes faced decline or destruction. The trade reshaped entire regions, redirecting energy that might have gone into farming, art, or scholarship into endless cycles of war and capture. The Europeans, for their part, depended heavily on these alliances. Without the cooperation of African leaders and groups, they could not have sustained the vast networks that carried millions across the Atlantic. The forts along the coast, the ships that arrived each season, and the goods that changed hands all relied on relationships forged with African intermediaries. This was not a story of simple conquest, but of negotiated arrangements that nonetheless had devastating consequences. In the end, the involvement of some African leaders and groups reveals the complexity of history. These were not passive actors but individuals and societies making choices under immense pressures. Some sought power, others survival, and still others wealth. Their decisions, however, fed into a system that grew larger than any one leader or kingdom could control. Once the trade expanded, it reshaped Africa as much as it did the Americas and Europe. The alliances forged in those centuries remind us that history is rarely simple. Power, survival, rivalry, and ambition all played roles in shaping decisions that changed the course of the world. While European traders built the ships and demanded the labor, it was often African hands that delivered captives to the coast. Together, these forces created a system whose consequences echo across continents even today. The story of these alliances is not only one of tragedy but also one of lessons. It shows how the pursuit of advantage, when tied to external pressures and global demands, can spiral into something far greater than imagined. And it reminds us that within every great historical system are countless smaller choices made by leaders, warriors, and traders whose decisions helped shape the destiny of millions. In the summer of 1839, a ship named La Amistad sailed quietly along the Caribbean waters, carrying a group of Africans who had been torn from their homeland. Shackled and bound, they were meant to be delivered as laborers to plantations in Cuba. The men aboard were not warriors by profession, yet within them burned a deep resolve, a determination that would soon ignite one of the most remarkable acts of resistance in history. Among them was a man named Sengbi P., later known as Joseph Sink. His spirit remained unbroken despite the cruel journey across the Atlantic. He carried in his heart the memory of his home, his family, and his people. As the days passed on the ship, he and the others endured hunger, exhaustion, and despair. But Sink was not willing to surrender to fate. He whispered to his companions, speaking of freedom, courage, and the will to fight back. Slowly, a plan began to form. One moonlit night, the captives broke free of their chains. They moved quietly across the deck, seizing what weapons they could find. In a sudden burst of action, they rose against their captors. The crew, unprepared for such a revolt, was overwhelmed. With fierce determination, the Africans took control of the vessel, their cries of freedom echoing over the waves. For the first time since they had been taken from their homeland, they were no longer prisoners, they were leaders of their own destiny. Yet freedom on the open sea was far from certain. The surviving crew members who were spared promised to guide the ship back toward Africa, but instead deceived the rebels. By day, the Amistad sailed eastward as ordered, but by night, the crew secretly steered north. Days turned into weeks, and instead of reaching the shores of Africa, the ship eventually drifted toward the coast of the United States. When the Amistad was seized by an American naval vessel near Long Island, the story exploded across the nation. The Africans, who had fought so desperately for their freedom, were once again taken into custody. Authorities debated what to do with them. Were they criminals guilty of mutiny and murder? Or were they free people who had every right to resist their unlawful captivity? The case soon moved into the U.S. courts, sparking heated debates that reflected the larger national conflict over slavery. Many in the South demanded that the Africans be punished and returned. Others, particularly abolitionists in the North, argued that these men had been kidnapped illegally and had acted only to reclaim their natural right to freedom. The Amistad captives became symbols in a battle of ideas, between bondage and liberty, between human rights and exploitation. At the heart of the trial was the question of whether the captives were truly property, as their captors claimed, or whether they were free individuals who had been unlawfully seized. The Africans themselves spoke in their own defense. Though language barriers made communication difficult, their emotions and determination were clear. They wanted only to return home. The case eventually reached the highest court in the land, the United States Supreme Court. It was an unprecedented moment. The fate of these Africans would be decided not by soldiers or sailors, but by the judges of a nation still deeply divided on the issue of slavery. Former U.S. President John Quincy Adams, then an elder statesman, stepped forward to argue their case. In a passionate plea, he urged the court to recognize the humanity of the captives and their undeniable right to freedom. In 1841, the Supreme Court delivered its verdict. By a majority decision, the justices ruled in favor of the Africans. They declared that the captives had been taken illegally and had every right to fight for their freedom. The Amistad Africans were not criminals but free men, entitled to return to their homeland. The decision sent shockwaves across the world. For abolitionists, it was a triumph, a symbol of hope in a struggle that was still far from over. For those invested in the system of slavery, it was a warning that the moral foundations of their world were being challenged. But for the men of the Amistad, the ruling meant something more personal and profound, the chance to go home. With the help of supporters, the surviving captives were eventually able to return to Africa. They carried with them not only the memory of their ordeal but also the pride of their victory. Their revolt, their trial, and their eventual freedom became a story retold across generations, a story of resilience, justice, and the unyielding human desire for liberty. The Amistad Revolt was not the first act of resistance by Africans in the Americas, nor would it be the last. Across plantations, in cities, and on ships, countless men and women found ways to fight back, whether through open rebellion or quiet defiance. Yet the Amistad case stood out because it forced a powerful nation to confront the question of justice directly in its courts. It reminded the world that the struggle for freedom could not be silenced, no matter how tightly the chains were bound. The Africans aboard the Amistad had risen not only against their captors but against a system that sought to erase their humanity. And in doing so, they left behind a legacy that continues to inspire. The waves that carried the Amistad across the Atlantic eventually faded into history, but the story of its passengers lives on. It is a story of courage in the face of despair, of resistance against impossible odds, and of victory achieved through unity and faith. Above all, it is a reminder that the quest for freedom is a universal human truth, one that no ship, no chains, and no false law can ever fully contain. Across the centuries of the Atlantic trade, the cost in human life was staggering. Behind the numbers, behind the ledgers of merchants and the journals of ship captains, were millions of people who never reached the shores of the Americas. Their stories, though often unrecorded, form a shadowed history that still haunts the memory of the modern world. The ordeal began long before the ocean crossing. In African villages, raids, wars, and captures tore communities apart. People were seized suddenly, sometimes in the dead of night, sometimes in the chaos of battle. Families were split, parents separated from children, elders left behind in grief. Many did not even survive this first stage of capture. Resistance was common, and clashes often turned deadly. The path from the heart of Africa to the coast was itself a brutal journey. Chained, marched for miles, and deprived of food and water, countless men, women, and children collapsed along the way. For every person who reached the coastal forts, there were many whose bodies never left the forests or plains of their homeland. Those who survived the march were held in coastal prisons, awaiting the arrival of ships. Conditions in these holding pens were harsh. Overcrowding, disease, and hunger claimed lives before the captives ever saw the ocean. For some, despair proved overwhelming, and they chose to end their suffering rather than continue into the unknown. Even before stepping aboard a ship, the human toll was already immense. Then came the Middle Passage, the leg of the triangular trade that has become infamous for its cruelty. Ships designed for cargo were packed tightly with human beings, treated as little more than commodities. Rows upon rows of captives were forced into cramped spaces where movement was nearly impossible. The air was foul, food was scarce, and fresh water was limited. Illness spread rapidly, sweeping through the decks. Smallpox, dysentery, and fevers claimed many lives, sometimes entire groups within a single voyage. Mortality rates on these voyages were devastating. Historians estimate that between 15% and 25% of those forced onto ships perished before reaching land. On a vessel carrying hundreds, this meant dozens, sometimes hundreds, of souls lost to the sea. Their bodies were cast overboard, vanishing beneath the waves, leaving only silence in their wake. Survivors watched in horror as loved ones were taken from them, powerless to intervene. For them, the ocean became not only a barrier between past and future but also a graveyard of kin. Yet the suffering did not end with landfall. Those who endured the crossing faced new trials on unfamiliar soil. Exhausted, traumatized, and weakened, many died in the first weeks or months after arrival. Harsh labor, inadequate food, and exposure to new diseases all contributed to early mortality. Plantation life offered little respite, and the cycle of loss continued. Scholars have long debated how to categorize this immense destruction of life. Some describe it as genocide, a systematic attempt to erase populations and cultures. Others argue that while profit, not extermination, was the driving force, the scale of death makes the term difficult to avoid. What is undeniable is that entire generations were diminished. Africa lost millions, not only through death but also through displacement. Villages emptied, traditions were interrupted, and the cultural fabric of societies was forever altered. For those who lived through it, the memory of loss was inescapable. Oral traditions carried stories of people taken and never seen again. Songs and rituals evolved to mourn the absent, to honor the spirits of those who had fallen on the journey. Across the Atlantic, descendants of the survivors carried that grief into new lands, weaving it into their music, faith, and resilience. Even in the face of unimaginable suffering, communities found ways to endure, to preserve fragments of language, culture, and belief. Numbers alone cannot capture the human tragedy. To say that millions died is to speak in abstractions. But behind each number was a person, a child who once played in a village, a mother who sang lullabies, a father who tilled fields, a healer who knew the secrets of herbs, a storyteller who carried the wisdom of generations. Their absence reshaped families and entire societies. Their silence is part of the story. The debate among historians continues, but perhaps the label matters less than the acknowledgement. Whether we call it genocide or mass death through exploitation, the truth remains the same. The Atlantic trade was not only an economic system but also one of the greatest human catastrophes in history. It was a system that consumed lives at every stage: capture, transport, and enslavement, leaving scars on continents and on humanity itself. Today, when we remember this history, it is not simply to count the losses but to honor the resilience of those who survived. Despite the millions who perished, millions more endured. They rebuilt lives, formed families, and created cultures that continue to thrive across the globe. The survival of their descendants is itself a form of resistance, a refusal to let the past define the future. Yet remembrance also carries responsibility. To tell this story is to recognize the cost, to ensure that the voices of the lost are not forgotten. It is to understand that history is not only about the powerful but also about those who suffered in silence. By keeping their memory alive, we confront the weight of what was lost and the resilience of what endured. The oceans still hold the secrets of those who never reached the shore. The forests of Africa still whisper of those who vanished on the long marches. And the lands of the Americas still bear the marks of those who were taken too soon. Their absence is part of our shared human story, one that demands reflection, remembrance, and respect. In the end, the debate over words cannot overshadow the reality of lives extinguished. Whether called genocide or tragedy, the truth is clear: millions died in a system that placed profit over humanity. But their memory survives, in history, in culture, and in the determination of their descendants to tell their story. And it is in that act of remembering that justice, even belated, begins to take form. As the centuries unfolded, the transatlantic trade left marks so deep that they continue to echo into our present day. For the African continent, the devastation was profound. Entire generations were lost, entire regions weakened. Communities that once flourished with artisans, farmers, musicians, and storytellers were torn apart. Villages emptied, family lineages broken, and the balance of societies disrupted. The capture and forced movement of millions created ripples that fractured not just individuals, but the cultural, social, and political foundations of Africa itself. The scars of this disruption are visible even now, in the struggles of nations that endured centuries of population loss and destabilization. On the other side of the ocean, the effects were very different. Europe saw the rise of extraordinary wealth. From the docks of Liverpool to the counting houses of Lisbon, from the banks of Amsterdam to the markets of Paris, fortunes were built upon this human trade. The profits fed empires, fueled industries, and accelerated the growth of nations that would dominate the globe for centuries to come. Sugar, cotton, tobacco, and coffee, all products harvested by captive labor, flooded European markets, creating luxuries for some while masking the suffering of others. Behind the shining palaces and bustling ports lay an unspoken truth: the prosperity of Europe was built, in large part, on the backs of millions who never chose this fate. Yet the impact was not only economic. The trade entrenched an ideology, an attempt to justify inequality by creating hierarchies of race. The categorization of people, the labeling of some as less human, seeped into laws, institutions, and daily life. Over time, these beliefs hardened into systems of prejudice that did not end with the trade itself. They grew into structures that endured long after the last ships had sailed, shaping societies in both subtle and overt ways. Racism became not just a byproduct of the trade, but one of its most enduring legacies, one that still challenges us across the world today. In the Americas, new cultures were born under harsh conditions. Though communities were forged through struggle, they carried resilience, music, language, and faith across generations. These cultures enriched the world with rhythms, cuisines, and traditions that remain vibrant today. But alongside that cultural inheritance came inequality, systems of power and wealth distribution that kept the descendants of the enslaved at the margins. From plantation fields to segregated cities, the weight of this legacy can be traced in histories of poverty, discrimination, and social unrest. Global inequality, in many ways, is a living reminder of this history. The trade did not end when the last ship docked. Its consequences ripple through time, shaping relationships between nations, shaping perceptions of identity, shaping the struggles for justice that still unfold in our streets and our institutions. When we look at the world today, its uneven wealth, its tensions, its cultural richness and its divisions, we are looking, in part, at the aftershocks of this vast and painful history. But it is also important to recognize the resilience. Though millions suffered, millions endured. They rebuilt lives, formed families, and created cultures that could not be erased. They left behind a legacy of strength, creativity, and survival. The fact that their descendants thrive today, that their voices are louder than ever, is itself a story of triumph. Against all odds, people carried forward songs, stories, and dreams. They proved that even in the darkest chapters of history, the human spirit can refuse to be broken. To reflect on this history is not merely to dwell on sorrow. It is to learn, to understand, and to acknowledge. It is to honor those who came before and to recognize the structures we have inherited. And most importantly, it is to ask ourselves what we can do to ensure that inequality, born in centuries of injustice, does not continue into the future. Each generation has the chance to confront the past honestly and to build something better. Remembering is the first step, but acting on that memory is the true challenge. This journey through history reminds us of how deeply connected we all are. The story of Africa, Europe, and the Americas is not separate, it is shared. The legacies of the trade do not belong to one people or one continent, they belong to all of us, for they shape the world we live in today. To forget them would be to forget part of ourselves. To remember them is to reclaim our humanity. So, as we close this chapter of the story, let us carry with us not only the weight of the past but also the hope for the future. May we listen to the lessons of history, may we honor the resilience of those who endured, and may we find inspiration to build a world that values justice, equality, and dignity for all. If you found meaning in this story, if you believe these voices from history deserve to be heard, I invite you to support this journey. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and help us continue to uncover and share the hidden stories of our shared past. Together, we can ensure that these lessons are never forgotten, and that we move toward a future built on truth and understanding. Thank you for listening, and may you all have a peaceful and restful night.